we're going to turn it over to Annette Jorgensen, Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center's Membership and Development Coordinator. Annette, take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me start this. Okay. So the first thing I need to do is let you know about this photograph that you see here. It's from the collection of Juanita Leish. Some of you may know who she is. She's a great collector of CDVs and original garments. And she's allowed me to use this photograph, which is a homespun dress, and it was worn between 1860 and 1865. Also, this research was conducted by Vicki Betts, and she kind of got away from it a little bit and she handed it over to me. So I get to now play with homespun dresses, which is always a lot of fun. So we're going to talk about a silk purse from a pig's ear, fashioning homespun in the mid-19th century South. This is probably a song that y'all know. It's called The Southern Girl, and or it's also called The Homespun Dress. And in the Chicago Tribune in June 24th, 1864, there was a letter that the accompanying song is from a letter of a Southern girl to her lover in Lee's army, which letter was obtained from a mail captured on our march through northern Alabama. The materials of which the dress alluded to is made in cotton and wool and are woven on the hand loom as commonly seen in the houses at the South. The scrap of the dress enclosed with the letters, a sample, was a gray color with a stripe of crimson and green, quite pretty and credible to the lady who made it. Now, this song is actually attributed to Carrie Bell Sinclair in 1862, and it praises women for wearing the homespun dresses in support of the South during the Civil War. The homespun dress has become the symbol of the hardscrabble life many experienced before, during, and after the Civil War. But how common was it really? Was it worn as purely a sign of pride, as suggested by the song, or was it worn out of necessity when all other fabric choices were used up? Tonight, we'll examine some periods of accounts of using homespun. And then we'll also, interspersed in there, we'll be looking at some dresses that Vicki Betts was able to actually get up and touch and get touchy-feely with. So first we need to define what is homespun. Homespun can be all hand spun and hand woven. That's usually what we think of when we think homespun. But if you look at the examples left from the time, it can also be factory spun warp with a hand spun filler, and then the fabric is hand woven. Or it can be the thread is all factory spun and the fabric is hand woven. Or it is all factory spun and factory woven in the South, where home is equal to the South. And this is supposed to resemble true hand woven homespun. And then you get the lovely fake homespun. This is factory spun and woven in the North, and it is considered a cheap imitation. So you'll see that there are so many different variations of what was available as far as homespun during the 1860s. And it's impossible to know for sure what kind of homespun is being discussed in sources unless it specifically mentions how it was produced. But do keep these definitions in mind as we go forward in describing some of these homespun dresses. So by the time of the Civil War, spinning and weaving for home use was not really as common as it was earlier in US history. Diaries and newspapers often mention taking spinning wheels out of the attic, or of women having to learn to spin and weave. However, some women were producing homespun for retail purposes, selling their homespun thread or home woven fabric for public consumption. Between 1915 and 1922, 200 Tennessee Confederate veterans responded to a state survey, with 182 answering the following questions. State clearly what the duties of your mother were. State all kinds of work done in the house as well as you can remember, that is cooking, spinning, weaving, etc. Of those 182, the following results were tabulated for textile production. So 128 responded that their mother spun. Only one person mentioned that his mother died. 126 actually wove the fabric, and only 22 carded the raw silk, or excuse me, the raw wool or cotton. And in addition, 11 veterans stated that their mothers superintended slaves who spun and wove. Mary Love Fleming, remembered in Dale County, Alabama. At first, few knew how to spin and weave, but my aunt, Mrs. Bennett, and some of the older women in the Beard, Martin, and Johnson families had learned to spin and weave long years before, and they now gladly taught relatives and all others who wished to learn. Women from all over that section of the country went to them to learn how to manage the spinning wheels and the looms. Kate Cummings writes from Georgia in 1862, this lady had 2 young daughters who were busy weaving and spinning. They had on dresses spun and woven by themselves. This ancient work is all the fashion now, as we are blockaded and can get no other kinds of goods. Diaries of the planter class in the South often give the impression that plantation mistresses produced multitudes of cloth and thread. In her letters to her husband, Harriet Perry mentions several times the amount of cloth her mother-in-law managed to spin. In 1862, she writes, the spinning machine spins 13 yards of cloth per day. They have 2 looms weaving now. By October, she is making 90 yards of cloth a week. And by February 1863, she had made nearly 2,000 yards of cloth. As often as Harriet mentions her mother-in-law making cloth, you would think she was a very busy woman, skilled in spinning and weaving. However, it is the enslaved persons of the plantation doing the work, male and female. Harriet comments that Aunt Betsy, who is an enslaved woman, is with all the looms all the time. Also, Willis and 2 women spin from light till dark. Willis and the 2 women spin the warp for 15 yards every day. And the women who have young babies are spinning with the hand. Making a completely homespun, homemade dress is very time consuming, taking more time than the typical white woman in the 19th century was willing to devote to clothing production without help. W.N. Watt, in the early cotton factories in North Carolina and Alexander County, estimated that it took 360 hours to produce 30 yards of homespun fabric. That's 160 hours to pull the cotton by hand from the seed and card, if the cards were available. And we can also apply this to wool as well. The manufacturing of cards became less of a priority once the war began, and the cost of cards when they could be bought went from $10 a pair to $80 a pair in the Confederacy. It takes 85 hours to spin and then hank the weft. And these are some examples of some homespun thread. 17 hours to gather bark, dye, size the thread, and spool the warp. 12 hours to quill the weft. 10 hours to warp, beam, harness, and slew the loom. And then 75 hours to weave the cloth. And that's a total of 36 days of 10 hours each. If the labor is proportionate, it should take almost 7 10-hour days to produce 5 2/3 yards of cloth for the fur dress currently owned by Vicki Betts. This is a dress she has in her own collection, and on my website, we also have a complete description of this dress, showing statistics, how wide the panels are, how long the sleeves are, how many stitches per inch. So if you're interested in that, let me know and I can get you that information. Betty Mills in Calico Chronicles estimated that it took 2 weeks to spin the thread for a dress, 1 week to weave and another week to cut and hand sew a dress, depending on the complexity. And just as a piece of trivia, I always found this very interesting. Using 36 threads per inch, 34 inches wide and 5 2/3 yards long. That is roughly 41,567 feet, which is close to 7.87 miles of weaving thread in just this dress alone. So dyeing, not only did you have to weave and prepare the raw materials, but you also had to dye it. Now there are, you're either dyeing the cotton or you're dyeing the cloth. And there are so many other people out there much more versed in the dyeing process than I am. So I am not going to go into that. If I can probably refer you to some individuals if you have dyeing questions, and I will see what I can do about that. But I would like to point out some things that were coming up in newspapers and in books and such. So we have this lovely little taunt from a Yankee that a North Carolina soldier passed on in 1864. The ladies down south, they do not deny they used to drink the coffee and now they drink the rye. The ladies in Dixie, they are quite in the dark. They used to buy the indigo and now they buy the bark. So it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on down south. The most common mentioned Southern dyes are walnut, indigo, black oak, sassafras, hickory, maple, and longwood. And then you have a mordant, copperas or iron, alum or lye to set it. We also have in this diary is from Fanny Brown of Rusk County in Texas. And she entered instructions in her diary on how to make the dyes and what plants to use. And then by 1864, the Confederate government got into the business of producing instructions on dyeing wool and cotton. Purchasing homespun was an option if one did not want to go through the work of making it. The Perrys sold the cloth produced on their plantation at a rate of $100 to $125 a week. It is unclear who is actually buying the cloth. Based on the amounts, probably the government or other slave owners purchasing slave cloth. And even with all this cloth on hand, the Perrys themselves still purchased calico on the market. Harriet also mentions in 1862, everyone is very busy making cloth, and there's a good deal for sale for $1 and $1.25 per yard for common plain Negro cloth. Prices for homespun differed greatly by the year of the war and the location in the South. For example, in 1862, Southerners could find homespun for 50 cents to $4 a yard, depending where in the South they were. By 1865, the cost had risen to $8 to $10 a yard. Calico, on the other hand, in 1862, cost between 50 cents and $2 a yard, and by 1865, it ranged from $25 to $35 a yard. Oh, forgot one. M.J. Pearson of Lamar County, Texas, wrote to Mrs. Winstead in November 1863, I have sold some cloth at $1.50 a yard. The Southern Illustrated News published a letter from Louise in November 8, 1862. Well, Mr. Editors, I bought me a homespun dress, had it made up and wore it to church on Sunday last. Now, I think it's important to realize in this quote where she said she bought a homespun dress, meaning she bought the fabric to make a dress and then she had it made up. And if she wore it to church, I'm assuming it's going to be somewhat fashionable. We don't know if she made it herself or if she had someone make it for her or where she even bought the fabric, if she bought it in the general store, if she bought it from a private person. But the important thing is here that she bought the fabric. She did not make it. So why homespun? Since homespun was so labor intensive and obviously early in the war, other options were available. Why was it being used in fashion? Early in the war, it appears as a patriotic statement. Homespun as a patriotic statement dates back prior to the Revolution. It served to promote American industry, simplicity, and democracy, as opposed to British luxury and corruption. As tensions rose in 1860 and 1861, Southerners again turned to the old symbol, fully aware of homespun's historical significance. While across Virginia in late 1859, men met and spoke on self-dependence, by early 1860, quote, the ladies have begun to act. Without noise, they have commenced to give force and color to our resolutions, unquote, by sponsoring homespun parties. More than 100 ladies and gentlemen belonging to the most respected families in the city, now this is in Richmond, were present, all of whom were attired in part or in whole in garments of homespun. And in fact, this happened in Texas as well. The inauguration ball for the new governor in 1860 was a homespun ball, and all the gentlemen wore homespun, but all the ladies still wore their silks and everything. Elsie Hay from Georgia remembered in 1866, in the first burst of our patriotic enthusiasm, we started a fashion which it would have been wise to keep up. We were going to encourage home manufacture. We would develop our own resources, so we bought homespun dresses and had them fashionably made and wore them instead of outlandish finery. The soldiers praised our spirit and vowed that we looked prettier in homespun than other women in silk and velvet. A word from them was enough to seal the triumph of homespun gowns. Caroline Seabury wrote in her diary while in Mississippi in 1863, then they showed me cloths they had spun and woven of themselves, saying, I'll never wear homespun as long as I live before I depend on Yankees for it. The people were wild with non-consumption craze, going back to homespun jeans, lye soap, etc., long before the necessity was upon us, remembered Elizabeth Lyle Saxton. Homespun truly became a fashion, according to Clara Dunlap, when she wrote to her mother, Clarissa Dixon, in 1862. It does seem right diverting now, Ma, to go visiting and hear everyone discussing the merits of this, that, or other mode of dyeing, and how many cuts of such and such a number it takes to fill a yard of such a number, etc., and so on. But ain't it so different from a few years since when all the topic under discussion would be fashions, etc. But that amuses me with it all is to hear those that 1 year ago didn't know a bear in a harness from I don't know what, now talking and advising as though they did it all from long experience. But aside from all joking, I do think this war will be making of a great many women. Yeah, hold on a minute. Pages won't turn. Schools also encouraged homespun. In October 1860, 27 teachers and pupils of the Spring Hill School attended the Georgia State Fair, all attired in a substantial check homespun dress made fashionably full and flowing, a sight worth seeing in the Southern Fairgrounds. One of the students, Sarah Conley Clayton, later wrote about that experience. According to Mrs. Clayton, to show our patriotism at that critical time, we were all clad in homespun dresses made of my own hands, and the girls, with 2 or 3 exceptions, being under 16 years of age. We were a proud set and were confident of being the first to appear in Georgia cotton. So in our simply made blue and white and brown checks, with all eyes upon us, we walked proudly from the Union Depot out to the grounds on Fair Street near the cemetery. The girls did win a prize, but they were a little bit crestfallen to discover another homespun clad young lady also in attendance. Years later, Sarah could describe almost every detail. In her dress, a clear blue, bright blue with a predominating color, a narrow buff stripe, with probably a red and white thread running through it, alternating with the blue about every half inch. It was made quite stylishly, as I remember, more of a riding habit, a bright skirt and tight coat piped with buff and ornamented with numerous buttons. We understood that she herself had woven the material. Graduating classes made a special effort to patronize homespun, much as Harvard and Yale did during the Revolution. In March of 1860, the students of Mercer University pledged themselves to buy no more apparel of Northern manufacture. and to appear on the rostrum of our next annual commencement in Southern-made clothing. During the summer of 1861, an article entitled Homespun at the Mary Sharp announced that the young ladies graduating from this Baptist college in Winchester, Tennessee, had chosen homemade cotton dresses as their clothing of choice for commencement. It was designed to be emblematic of the intention of these young women to make themselves all the present condition of our country may require of her daughters to be. We have since heard of some of these graduates appearing at church in the same humble but becoming garb, where it elicited the earnest admiration of the right thinking of the other sex. Myrtle long remembered her cousin Carrie graduating from College Temple in Noonan, Georgia. The class chose homespun for the graduation dresses. The whole country praised the act. On that day, everybody was singing the popular song, "Hurrah, hurrah for the Southern girls, hurrah for the homespun dresses that the Southern ladies wear." Editors and correspondents noticed particular young ladies around the region who exemplified the Southern ideal home industry. Excuse me. I do want to show you one thing on this green dress that I have here. This is the trimming on it. And it seems that if a homespun dress was just a homespun dress, I don't think she would have put this much effort into making it pretty and decorating it. So the Charleston Mercury in November 1862, we observed while on a visit to a lady friend a bonnet and dress of Georgia and Lindsay and cotton, designed for the daughter of one of our leading secessionists. The dress is made in fashionable style, a la Gabrielle, and the bonnet is composed of white and black Georgia cotton, covered with a network of black cotton, the streamers ornamented with palmetto trees and lone stars, embroidered in gold thread, while the feathers are formed with white and black worsted. The entire work is domestic as well as the material and exhibits considerable ingenuity. The idea illustrates the patriotism of the ladies and their earnest sympathy with the great Southern movement, while its execution affords convincing proof of how independent we can be of Northern aggressors when we have the will to undertake and the energy to achieve. Excuse me. Within the next month, the Columbia, Georgia Times noted, "In the street yesterday was observed one of our pretty young ladies attired in a dress of Georgia homespun and wearing the blue cockade. The make of the dress and the style of the cloak gave it the appearance of silk at a distance and attracted the attention of all." In 1861, we have more accolades from the press. Two of Portsmouth, Virginia's fair daughters appeared in its streets Tuesday in homespun, and the general verdict was they looked charming. And then the Atlanta Locomotive reported that a gay and fashionable young lady attracted the attention at the fairgrounds yesterday because of a most handsome and neatly fitted copper's homespun dress, which she wore and seemed justly proud. She is wealthy of a fine family, and for her dress, which really was among the handsomest of any kind on the ground, she certainly deserves a grand premium. And we insist upon the Agricultural Society awarding her one. We heard a number of ladies wish for a dress like it, but whether they wished it because of the style of the goods or because they discovered it to be so popular, we will not say. But most assuredly, we were delighted to see this one Southern lady rigged out in homespun cloth. And I think it's also important here to notice that she was from a wealthy family. So she's wearing this as a symbol of her patriotism, not because she had to wear it. Oops. Let me tell you a little bit about this dress. I'm sorry. The original owner of this dress was Sarah Ann Stewart Harris Collar. She lived from 1832 to 1864. The original location of this dress was in Clark County, Alabama, and it is currently held by the Alabama Department of Archives and History in Montgomery. It was probably constructed between 1862 and 63. She was from a wealthy family. They owned 23 slaves in 1860, and her husband's occupation was a cotton farmer. And the dress itself is a cotton dress. Miss T, the daughter of a friend of an editor of the Atlanta Southern Confederacy, arrived at that printing establishment in 1824, dressed in a beautiful checked homespun white and blue. Copperas and turkey red colors were beautifully woven into the fabric. It really was refreshing. Then it fit right. It was not only spun and wove, but cut and fit by the accomplished wearer who has just completed a collegiate education. Let us have more homespun dresses, enough at least to destroy the novelty. And let us have more good warm jeans for gentlemen and for soldiers to wear this winter. By fall, the Charleston Courier was noticing many beautiful damsels were seen yesterday on King Street in suits of homespun. We trust the example will be followed, and if our fair ladies know how much pleasure it affords to the volunteers and to all the good citizens, it would be generally and universally followed. If editorial comments were not enough, some prominent citizens sponsored homespun parties at various sorts of fairs and, homespun parties of various sorts, and of course at fairs in order to help raise funding for the armies. This one is the Ladies Relief Society. This one happens to be in Baltimore. On September 24th, 1861, the ladies of the society are to have a fair next Tuesday evening and hope for the sake of the cause prompting it to have a full attendance. Tickets are for admission of 25 cents, and the ladies will appear in Southern homespun. And then in Milledgeville, Georgia, the ladies of the city, or at least a good many of them, had a homespun party at Newell's Hall on last Thursday evening, which was decidedly the most pleasant affair that has occurred in the city for many years. The ladies all wore homespun dress, and their persons were tastefully and appropriately ornamented with native jewels and charms. Many of the dresses, though of the plainest cotton fabric, were beautiful, and the wearers looked charming in them. The group was delighted with the first experiment of a social gathering in plain and unpretending attire. In Leake County, Mississippi, Colonel Donald gave a party in which the ticket sent to each young lady required that she should come dressed in Mississippi manufactured apparel, in the manufacture of which she must have in some way assisted. The gentlemen were also required to dress in a manufacture of Mississippi made in Leake and Attala. There were near 100 persons of both sexes in attendance, all attired as specified above. And then in Georgia, there was a group of ladies that gave a homespun picnic. We were not present, but learned that a great number of the fashion and beauty of the city were there, and several gentlemen and many of the young ladies dressed in plain but neat homespun dresses. This is praiseworthy. Let me kind of explain what a homespun party is, since I didn't throw this in here. It's a party where you would obviously go in homespun. In some of the fairs, the women would actually wear finer clothes underneath, wear their homespun dress on top of that, and at some point in the evening would take off the homespun dress and then finish the evening out in their fancier dress. These homespun dresses were then given to the poor that needed clothing. In Atlanta, in one of the fairs sponsored by the Ladies Relief Society in September 1861, the notice in the newspaper announced that they will be in Southern homespun. One of the most interesting accounts, however, is in an Alabama homespun ball. Mrs. Elizabeth Lyle Saxon recalled the preparations as leading up to the event and the unintended results. The young ladies were preparing for a grand ball that was soon to be given, and 4 of them were going to wear homespun dresses. The 4 girls were sewing on their dresses vile-smelling common check goods, such as we used to use for our servants at that time. They were making them with long trains, low neck, and short sleeves, and the lace they were trimming them was with Ponte Elecon, Honiton, and Valencia lace, suitable for the dress of a duchess at a court ball. When the ball came off, the girls looked as lovely as when in satin or lace, for the dresses fitted their perfect figures to a charm. One of the young men who had danced with all four of them came to me and, taking me to one side, asked in a hollow whisper, "Miss Lizzie, what in heaven's name is that smells so awful about those girls?" "Why, is it a new perfume they are using?" I said. "They call it patriotism. I call it indigo dye." "Oh," he said, "it is the dresses. Why didn't they wash them? It's a horrid smell." I told the girls about it, and when they got home, they were a beautiful blue all about their necks, and they hardly allowed the word homespun ever to be uttered to them until we really had to make it at home and wear it. The young Southern ladies of 1860 and 1861 created and ostentatiously wore their homespun dresses as a means of being heard politically, without leaving their separate spheres and without having the vote. Homespun became for them a visible tie with their heroic and independent past and a uniform to match the gray of their brothers and beaux. Some soon became disillusioned with the fashion, however, putting their dresses aside when they washed poorly or were too hot to wear. Amanda McDowell of White County, Tennessee, writes in October 1864, "We have got our wool ready. At last, oh, I am getting so tired of picking, coloring, carding, spinning, etc. I would secede from it if I could conveniently." They also made relatively little use of homespun, depending instead on a remade finery of pre-war times or on new clothing obtained from outside the South. A young Georgia aristocrat wrote one of her friends in 1863, "I am going into the federal lines and expect to get the prettiest wardrobe from which Paris or France afford. I am so delighted, for really I have not felt ladylike for the past 2 years. My wardrobe has been in such a dilapidated condition." I am only speaking of those who go to Memphis, that renowned place where our fair ladies go to take the oath of allegiance to their particular friend and protector, Abe Lincoln. They are not true-hearted Southern women, but ladies who cannot wear Dixie silk, that is, and the noble and patriotic homespun, but must have the finest and best their favorite city, which Memphis can afford. I have several times been laughed at and made the subject of rude remarks by the hopeful daughters of two of our Fairtown ladies who are noted for going to Memphis and wearing Yankee finery, because I had on patriotic homespun. The Memphis Daily Appeal included an article in February 1864, "You who in the first flush of patriotism gave $25 to $30 for homespuns and ostentatiously wore them, do not discard them now because they wash badly and cost so much." In Georgia, 1863, the Richmond Sentinel, "In Atlanta and Macon, the ladies dress as in times of peace, have an abundance of fine clothes, and ride in fine carriages drawn by fat, sleek horses. Fine bonnets and silk dresses are as thick as blackberries. Homespun by the city ladies is not much worn. It is not becoming, they say, and gives them rather a plebeian appearance." In Savannah in 1863, "Where are all the ladies who, when the war broke out, were going to wear nothing but homespun during the war? They were wearing out their old summer dresses, to be sure. You would not expect them to wear heavy homespun when the thermometer up in the 90s. That was from the Mobile Advertiser. A still better reason is that calico is cheaper. Besides being more comely, our observation teaches that homespun is about the dearest everyday dress a lady can wear. And having had to foot several bills in that line, it has cured us completely on the subject of domestic manufactures for ladies' dresses. What with trimming to make them look decent, the fading after the first introduction to the wash tub, and consequently early abandonment, it is poor economy to indulge in homespun dresses. Celine Fremo remembers in Louisiana, later, some of the neighbors called, Mrs. Wiley, Mrs. Cross, and Miss Perry, etc. All were pretty women and were dressed in silk dresses protected by aprons, small, fancy aprons. Grown people's nice clothes lasted pretty well the 4 years. With children, it was different. We grew out of them. But in late 1862, many civilians were beginning to turn back to homespun after necessity, as the blockade cleared off the merchant shelves and the Confederate Army consumed much of what came out of the Southern textile mills. Eventually, even the Alabama girls with the Velveteen lace really had to make it at home and wear it. A soldier's wife wrote to the Mobile Register and Advertiser in 1863, "We would make it convenient to close the doors of these extortioners and goods as well as everything else. The blockade goods do a poor man's family no good whatever. They have not enough money to buy a yard, to say nothing of a bolt of calico, domestic or any other kind of goods. This thing has to stop." In September 1864, Sarah Wilkins wrote, if the war lasts much longer, I do not know what baby and I am to do for clothes. We are both very needy. Some people run the blockade and get things. I believe your pa would go in rags before he would trade with the enemy. I could not go in their lines, but if I had money or cotton and could get the chance, I would supply myself with clothes. Agnes wrote from Richmond in 1863, "Do you realize the fact that we shall soon be without a stitch of clothes? There is not a bonnet for sale in Richmond. Some of the girls smuggle them, which I for one consider as the worst possible taste, to say the least. We have no right at this time to dress better than our neighbors, and besides, the soldiers need every cent of our money. Heaven knows I would costume myself in coffee bags if that would help, but having no coffee, where could I get the bags?" Some women stocked up but wanted homespun to save the better dresses. "I don't need them until next winter, as I bought several calico dresses last winter, and those with what I had will do me all this and next year with care. But I wanted some homespun dresses to wear about home to save my others, as there is not a yard of calico, gowns, or anything else in Camden except barrage or Swiss, etc." wrote a woman in Arkansas, 1862. Kate Stone refugeed from Louisiana to Texas, and she did everything in her power to not resort to homespun. But then in May of 1864, she wrote, "We are at last using homespun. Hemmed a dozen towels today, looking much like a dish towels of old. Little sister is to have an outfit from the same piece, but she quite glories in the idea of wearing homespun and coming out as a regular Texan. This dress here was originally owned by Martha Evelina Dancy Ledbetter, and she lived in LaGrange, Texas. It was put together about 1864. The family had 125 slaves at the time that the dress, or in the 1860 census, and her father's occupation was a cotton farmer. And you can see it's really pretty stylish for the 1860s, and it is indeed homespun. Harriet Perry, whose mother-in-law was making all of that homespun, felt strongly about using homespun, as she wrote to her husband in 1864, "You spoke of a suit Lieutenant Dukes had and expressed a wish for some like it, and said you thought it better taste to wear homemade goods. It is cheaper for you to wear any other kind, and I know it looks better than the homespun. The latter is so smutty and dirty, I do not like it." This particular piece of homespun is actually here in Pennsylvania. It's at the State Museum in Harrisburg. It is important to notice that in the quotes used in this presentation, only a few have actually detailed what kind of homespun they're using, whether it's purchased, factory made, or they produced it by themselves. There's a couple more here. There's this dress is from Atlanta. It was probably owned by a Catherine Williams. And the original location of the dress was in the Fairport, Granville County in North Carolina, and it is currently at the Atlanta History Center. We don't know for sure when it was constructed. It was probably wartime. In 1860, the family had 70 slaves, and the father's occupation was tobacco farmer. And there's a close-up of the fabric. You can see how fine it is. How wonderful open weave, and it's almost like a barrage. It's so open, and it's a very nicely done piece of fabric. And then, of course, we have the children's. These the one little short on the left and the longer one on the right are both at the National Museum, the Civil War Museum in Richmond. And these are children's garments. The dress itself is said to have been spun and made by the girl that wore the dress. And so she must have been very young when she did that. And I'm sorry, I don't have any background on the other little yellow dress there at the top. Anyway, that is it. Were there any questions, Pete?
Nothing that has come in. If there are any questions, please, you can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. We would be happy to take them. I certainly learned a lot because I have to admit, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about women's clothing during the Civil War, but I guess I am happy that there are people out there that do that, because I think that it's got a deep, certainly it's got a deep history and implications beyond just the material culture, which is sort of where I tend to look. But yeah, thank you. Anybody have what was the life expectancy of homespun clothing? Charles asks.
Well, you'll notice that some of these, they say that, by the time they got washed, which was probably at least once a week, they faded. You'll notice also some of these dresses were falling apart. They had holes in them and such, but they did last up until now, so we could see them. But I would not give a homespun dress that was worn every day and laundered more than 3 or 4 years.
What were some of the dyes used? Hang on. What were some of the dyes used and available besides indigo? Asks Ellen.
There were natural dyes. They would use bark. They would use the indigo. They would use flowers. They would use nuts.
Well, I was going to say black walnut, right?
Black walnut,
yeah.
Yep. And the butternut color from the Confederate uniforms was made from a nut. They would also use grasses and things like that. Usually it was definitely the natural dyes, the nuts and the leaves and the barks that they used to dye it with.
Mary asks, books that you might recommend on homespun fabric and clothing. We're opening up a can here, I think.
You know what? And unfortunately, I don't have my books with me here, but Pete, can you unshare my screen? For some reason, my computer is not cooperating.
Yep.
Okay, and I can go into the chat, and I'll put in the chat my website. And from there, you can look at resources, and I have a bibliography on all sorts of things, but you can find different letters, you can find diaries, you can find fashion books. Calico Chronicles is very good, although some of the things that she has said in that book have since been proven to be inaccurate. There's another book called Hand to Spindle, which is also a great book, but it does concentrate a little bit earlier than the Civil War.
Jerry asks, what about men's clothing?
Men's clothing. Well, you saw that that one gentleman, Mr. Perry, who, by the way, didn't survive the war, he wanted a homespun coat and suit and pants and the vest and everything, and his wife wouldn't have it. And as I had said before, in Texas at the inaugural ball, all the men were wearing the homespun fabrics. They would make theirs up. Men's dress wasn't really all that fancy to begin with. You had your sack coat or your frock coat and your vest and your pants. Yeah. So it was just a matter of finding the fabric or having somebody make it for them or buying it on the market to make their clothing. But yes, they did wear it. But I don't think it wasn't the same kind of patriotic statement that the women did as the women. This was their only voice to support the Confederacy, basically, was to show their support by wearing the homespun rather than Northern made goods.
Nancy asks, you gave a lot of examples of homespun in the South, but yeah,
But-
you know where this is going. But did
Yeah.
Northerners experience the same?
I have not found any direct diary entries about Northerners wearing homespun. However, in the Illinois State Museum, they have a homespun dress, and I will go and visit it in June. So hopefully, and I apologize, I didn't have it for this presentation. The travel just didn't work itself out. But I'm hoping that they have a lot of background on that dress.
We'll have to do part two next winter.
There you go.
Part two
Yeah.
after Annette goes to Illinois.
So I'm really hoping that with that piece, there will be a little bit more opening, and we'll offer some other pathways to find some other stuff that might be up in the North. And then, of course, it may prove me wrong too. But I'm sure that there were Northern women who were wearing homespun, because not everybody in the North could afford the silks. So I'm sure some of them had to be making their own.
Well, a lot of positive reactions, starting with, I now understand what homespun is. So, it's almost kind of the same here. Your first or second, the slide where you showed, the different definitions of what it could be was right. Helpful. Carolyn says, Annette, you showed some remarkable examples to think about how to make a homespun dress from scratch, which I'm sure you have.
Yes, I have. And actually, the Vicki Betts, when she put this presentation together, she put some information out that I didn't put in this presentation, but you can find again on my website, that tells you who, if you're a reenactor, who you would be if you were wearing homespun, who was most likely to wear homespun. Then she also has a write-up on how best to produce a homespun dress for reenacting. So if that is your interest, definitely go to that website, look under fabric and under homespun, and it should all be there.
Excellent. And if you miss that website, because once we close the Zoom, that will be gone. But I'm sure that if you contact Annette through our website, she would be happy to share that with you.
Oh yes, definitely. You can reach me through the museum as well.
Yep. So that looks like that's it on the questions. So we will say good evening. Again, join us on April 21st as Cody, Caleb, and I each talk about our favorite stories from the history of the seminary and Schmucker Hall and the museum. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to Annette for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you on the Ridge soon.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Good night, everyone.